December 27th, 1944, 12:20 in the afternoon. Rail yard outside the town of Kassel, central Germany. Snow lay in thin patches between the frozen steel rails. The temperature hovered just below freezing. Mechanics from the German Reichsbahn Railway stood beside a line of dark tanker cars, while armed guards from the Panzer Lehr Division checked manifests under strict orders. The train consisted of 23 fuel tank wagons, 2 armored escort cars, and a Class 52 Kriegslokomotive steam locomotive, a simplified war engine designed to move heavy freight across bomb-damaged rail lines. Inside the tank, cars sat the most valuable liquid remaining in the German war economy: aviation gasoline, diesel, synthetic fuel derived from coal, approximately 600,000 liters. Every drop had come from the battered Luna Chemical Works, one of the last functioning fuel facilities still producing under constant bombing. Fuel in late 1944 was more valuable to Germany than ammunition. The Allied bombing campaign had targeted the entire German fuel network throughout the year. On May 12, 1944, more than 800 bombers from the United States Army Air Forces struck the synthetic plants that produced most of the German fuel supply. The damage had never truly been repaired. Production collapsed. Before the attacks, Germany produced roughly 180,000 tons of fuel each month. By December 1944, that number had fallen to less than 20,000 tons. The consequence was immediate and visible across the German military. Armored divisions still possessed tanks. They simply could not move them. Inside the rail yard that afternoon, Colonel Paul Freiherr von Hauser, logistics officer attached to Panzer Lehr Division, inspected the final loading list. His division was positioned west of Kassel as part of the strategic reserve behind the Battle of the Bulge front. The offensive had begun December 16th at 5:30 in the morning along the Ardennes forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. Adolf Hitler had committed the remaining German armored strength in a desperate attempt to split Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. But even in the first week of the offensive, the fuel situation was collapsing. German armored spearheads had outrun supply. Several Panther tank units had already been abandoned simply because their fuel tanks ran dry. Colonel von Hauser understood the numbers. Panzer Lehr Division alone required 300,000 liters of fuel every day to maintain even limited armored movement. The train behind him carried barely enough for 2 days of combat operations. Yet without it, the division could not move at all. A lieutenant from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion approached with a clipboard. "The locomotive crew reports pressure is ready," the officer said. The locomotive engineer, Otto Schneider, stood in the cab of the Kriegslokomotive, feeding coal into the firebox while steam pressure climbed past 16 bar inside the steel boiler. Schneider had driven freight trains since 1933. Now he moved strategic cargo under military escort. The route ahead stretched 160 miles west toward the Rhine rail network. But the map spread across the rail table showed a dangerous reality. Nearly every major junction had been bombed. Allied fighter aircraft now hunted German rail traffic during daylight hours. The train would move anyway. At 12:35 in the afternoon, the final couplings were secured. 2 flat cars carrying 20mm flak 38 anti-aircraft guns were positioned at the front and rear of the convoy. The crews belonged to a Luftwaffe air defense detachment assigned specifically to protect high-value rail cargo. The guns fired 480 rounds per minute, effective against low-flying fighter aircraft, in theory. In practice, Allied pilots often attacked before crews could even swing the barrels upward. Colonel von Hauser signed the movement order. Departure time, 1:05 in the afternoon. If the fuel arrived at the armored staging areas near the Ardennes front, several German tank battalions could resume offensive operations. If it did not arrive, entire armored formations might remain frozen in place, and the Allied advance toward the Rhine could accelerate. Steam roared from the locomotive valves. At 1:05, the heavy train began rolling west. Steel wheels screeched across frozen rails as the convoy gathered speed. The escort commander, Captain Dietrich Lang, stood in the rearguard car studying the sky through binoculars. Cloud cover hung low across central Germany. That was good. Allied fighter aircraft preferred clear weather, but the rail line ahead crossed open farmland for miles. No tunnels, few forests, no real cover. And the Allied air forces had begun a systematic hunt for something specific: fuel. By January 1945, intelligence reports from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force would describe German fuel reserves as critically low. But on this afternoon in December 1944, one train still carried enough fuel to change a local battle, if it reached its destination. What the German crew did not know was that Allied reconnaissance aircraft had already photographed the Kassel rail yard earlier that morning, and somewhere above the clouds, fighter pilots were already searching the rail lines. The train carrying Germany's last usable fuel had begun its journey. The question was whether it could survive the first 50 miles. December 27th, 1944, 2:15 in the afternoon, 10 miles west of Kassel. The freight locomotive pushed forward at 30 miles per hour, its steel wheels clattering across frozen rail joints. Steam trailed behind the engine in white clouds that drifted across the winter fields. Engineer Otto Schneider watched the pressure gauges inside the cab. The Krieg's locomotive boiler held steady at 15 bar, enough power to pull the heavy fuel convoy across the gradual incline ahead. Behind him stretched the cargo that could not be lost. 23 tanker cars, 600,000 liters of fuel. Inside the rear escort wagon, Captain Dietrich Lang stood beside the open observation hatch with binoculars raised toward the gray sky. His escort force consisted of 12 Luftwaffe anti-aircraft soldiers operating 2 Flak 38 guns mounted on rail flat cars. Each weapon fired 20mm high explosive rounds capable of damaging low-flying fighters. But the guns had limits. Effective firing range against fast aircraft was barely 1,000 yards, and Allied pilots rarely flew in straight lines during attack runs. Lang understood the mathematics of survival. If Allied fighters spotted the train, the escort would have less than 20 seconds to react. The convoy rolled westward past empty farms and bomb-damaged signal towers. Several rail switches had been destroyed earlier in the year during Allied raids. German railway repair teams had patched the tracks with temporary steel plates. Speed had to remain low. The slow pace increased danger. At 2:32 in the afternoon, the train crossed a narrow river bridge near the village of Bebra, a rail junction that had once handled more than 200 trains per day before the war damage. Now only a handful of military convoys passed through each week. Captain Lang lowered his binoculars and stepped inside the wagon to review the escort orders again. Protect the fuel at all costs. The document came directly from the logistics command of Army Group B. Fuel trains were now considered Category 1 strategic cargo. That classification meant every available escort weapon had to defend them. But the classification did not change the larger strategic reality. By late 1944, the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces had achieved overwhelming air superiority across Western Germany. Allied aircraft conducted armed reconnaissance patrols, also called rail-cutting missions. Their objective was simple: destroy locomotives. Without locomotives, Germany could not move fuel, ammunition, or reinforcements. The train continued west. At 2:55 in the afternoon, Engineer Schneider noticed something unusual. The sky ahead had cleared. Cloud cover thinned across a wide stretch of farmland. Sunlight reflected off patches of snow, making the rails shine like silver lines stretching toward the horizon. Good visibility. That was dangerous. At almost the same moment, 17,000 feet above the rail line, 2 fighter aircraft from the 365th Fighter Group moved eastward during an armed patrol. The pilots flew P-47 Thunderbolt aircraft, carrying 500-pound bombs and 8 50-caliber machine guns. Lieutenant Robert Keller sat inside the lead aircraft cockpit, scanning the ground through broken cloud layers. His mission briefing had been clear: search rail lines, destroy locomotives. Fuel shortages had already crippled German armored movement during the Battle of the Bulge offensive. Every destroyed train tightened that pressure. At 3:02 in the afternoon, Keller saw it. A thin column of steam rising from the valley below. He pushed the control stick forward slightly and descended through the clouds. The convoy appeared beneath him, a long freight train moving west along a narrow rail corridor. Keller recognized the shape instantly. Tanker cars. Fuel. Inside the German train, Captain Lang heard the distant sound before he saw the aircraft. A low mechanical roar, the sound of a radial engine diving from altitude. He stepped outside the escort wagon and looked up. 2 dark shapes dropped through the clouds. American fighter aircraft. The distance closed rapidly. Lange shouted to the gun crews, "Flak positions ready." The Luftwaffe gunners swung the Flak 38 cannons upward. Magazines snapped into place. Each magazine carried 20 rounds. At 3:03 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Keller armed his weapons. 8 50-caliber machine guns loaded with armor-piercing rounds. He lined the aircraft nose with the locomotive. Destroy the engine, stop the train. The German gunners opened fire first. 20mm shells streaked upward in bright flashes. The escort crews had reacted quickly, but Keller had already begun the attack dive. His Thunderbolt screamed toward the rails at nearly 300 miles per hour. Inside the locomotive cab, Engineer Schneider saw the fighter coming straight toward them. There was no place to hide, no tunnel, no forest, only open track. The entire convoy stretched helplessly behind the engine, and every tanker car carried fuel that Germany could not replace. The first American attack run was seconds away. If the locomotive exploded, the fuel train would become a burning signal visible for miles, and the armored divisions waiting for that fuel would remain stranded on frozen roads across the Ardennes front. December 27th, 1944. 3:03 in the afternoon. Rail line near Bebra, central Germany. The American fighter aircraft descended fast. Lieutenant Robert Keller pushed the nose of the P-47 Thunderbolt downward until the long freight train filled the entire gun site. At nearly 300 miles per hour, the aircraft dropped below 5,000 feet. His target was simple: destroy the locomotive. Without the engine, the train could not move. Without movement, the cargo would be trapped on open rails. Inside the cab of the Class 52 Kriegs locomotive, engineer Otto Schneider gripped the throttle lever while steam pressure rattled the metal gauges. He saw the fighter diving directly toward the locomotive boiler. There was no protection for a train under air attack, no armor, no maneuver, only speed. Schneider pulled the throttle fully open. Steam roared through the pistons as the locomotive pushed beyond 30 miles per hour, the heavy tanker cars jolting violently behind it. On the escort flat car, Luftwaffe gunners fired their Flak 38 upward in rapid bursts. Each cannon fired high explosive shells designed to detonate near aircraft wings or engines. Bright flashes filled the sky around the diving fighter, but Keller held his course. At 3:04 in the afternoon, the American pilot pressed the firing trigger. 8 50 caliber machine guns erupted along the Thunderbolt wings. More than 100 rounds per second streaked toward the locomotive. Armor-piercing bullets tore through the steel skin of the boiler housing and smashed across the forward rail platform. The first rounds struck the locomotive smokestack and tore metal fragments into the air. Another burst shattered the glass of the cab windows. Inside the cab, shards of glass sprayed across the control panel. Engineer Schneider ducked low but kept one hand on the throttle. If the train slowed, the next attack run would destroy them. Behind the locomotive, the first tanker cars rattled violently as bullets punched small holes through the thin steel walls. Fuel began leaking from one damaged car. But the cargo had not ignited. Not yet. The Thunderbolt screamed overhead and climbed sharply. Lieutenant Keller pulled the aircraft into a steep turn to prepare a second attack pass. Below him, the long German fuel train continued moving west. The escort gunners reloaded fresh magazines into the Flak 38 cannons. 20 rounds per magazine, they had already fired more than half their ammunition during the first attack. Captain Dietrich Lang watched the fighter aircraft circle above them. He understood the situation clearly. One fighter could damage the locomotive. 2 or 3 fighters could destroy the entire train, and Allied patrols often flew in pairs. Above the battlefield sky, Keller spoke over the radio to his wingmen. The second pilot had remained higher in the clouds during the first attack. Now he descended through the broken cloud layer. 2 American fighters prepared for the next pass. The train below was still moving. That surprised Keller. Normally, locomotives stopped immediately after the first strafing run, but this engineer was pushing the engine harder instead. The train accelerated slowly toward 35 miles per hour as Schneider forced the locomotive beyond normal operating limits. Steam pressure climbed dangerously close to 18 bar, near the maximum safe level for the boiler. If the pressure rose any higher, the locomotive itself might explode. Yet Schneider did not reduce power. He understood what the cargo behind him represented. Fuel for armored divisions fighting in the Battle of the Bulge. Across the Ardennes front, several German tank formations had already halted due to empty fuel tanks. Battalions operating Panther tank vehicles required more than 700 liters of gasoline for a single day of maneuver operations. Entire divisions were waiting for deliveries like the one behind Schneider locomotive. Without fuel, armored offensives stopped. Without movement, the German strategy to divide Allied forces collapsed. That was the true strategic weight inside those tanker cars. The second American fighter began its attack dive at 3:06 in the afternoon. This pilot aimed farther back along the train, directly at the tanker cars. If even one car ignited, the explosion could spread across the entire convoy. The escort gunners opened fire again. Shells burst around the descending aircraft, but the fighter kept coming. Inside the locomotive, Schneider shouted to the firemen to shovel more coal into the furnace. The locomotive wheels rattled violently against the rails as the speed climbed again. 35 miles per hour. 38. The rails ahead curved toward a narrow forest corridor. Trees. Cover. If the train reached the forest line, the fighters would lose clear visibility of the tanker cars. The distance to the trees was less than 1,000 yards. But the American fighter was already diving toward the fuel cars. Machine guns opened fire again. Bullets tore into the rear tanker wagons. Fuel sprayed across the rail line. Yet the train did not explode. Not yet. The locomotive surged forward as steam blasted from the exhaust valves. The first trees of the forest line rushed closer. 800 yards, 600. The American fighter fired one final burst before pulling upward to avoid the rising ground ahead. Seconds later, the long freight train disappeared into the forest corridor. The fighters circled above the trees, searching for another clear attack angle. But the dense winter forest blocked their view of the rails. Below the branches, the damaged train continued west. Fuel leaked from several punctured tank cars, but the convoy still moved. Engineer Schneider finally reduced the throttle as the locomotive entered deeper forest cover. The cargo had survived the first attack. Strategically, the outcome mattered far beyond this rail line. If even part of the fuel cargo reached the armored reserves near the western front, several German tank battalions could resume limited movement. But the larger reality of the war remained unchanged. By early January 1945, Allied bombing and fuel shortages would immobilize much of the German armored force across Western Europe. Trains like this one had become rare, each carried a shrinking resource, and each journey grew more dangerous. The war machine of Germany still had tanks, guns, and soldiers. What it no longer had was fuel,